Good morning. We're in West Monroe, Kansas, and I'm with Victor Boccia. He was instrumental in creating Big Brutus as a historical attraction, and he's going to tell us some things about how that happened. Good morning, Victor.
Good morning. Nice to be here with you today.
Good.
So, the way I understand it, you'd like to know how Brutus actually became a museum and what it took to make that happen. And so it all begins actually right here in this store. And this is my great-grandparents' grocery store. They started in 1907. And then my grandparents took it over in the early 1930s. And then I took it over in the early 1980s. And so when I was working here running the store, the old grocery store, there were people who would come in. It'd be the middle of the winter, cold and snowy, rainy, whatever, the hottest day in the year, whatever, and we'd get customers coming in, and they would say, "We were just out at Brutus," and because Brutus only sits about a mile outside of town here, and so they would come in and they would be filthy with grease and dirt, because it had a big fence around it, about 12-foot fence with the wire on the top and everything. But people would crawl under it, take wire cutters and cut it and get in, and then they'd climb on it. And it was filthy from being sitting there for 11 years without being used.
Because it was just abandoned in place.
It was just abandoned in place. The last place it dug was the spot where it sits, right? It dug a ramp out of the strip pit and then to bedrock. And then it set itself on that bedrock, made a pad for itself so it wouldn't sink down in the soil, and get tipsy or anything. And so they made it kind of like a bowl area. And it sat it there and then swang the shovel around so that it faces east towards the pit the last pit it dug, turned it off, and that was the last time it ran. And that would have been in April of 1974. And so then it sat there all these years without being used, and like I say, people were coming in constantly. And so anyway,
it's interesting that there was no planning about this. The call came in to shut down, and it just happened to be right here at West Monroe.
Yeah.
It could have been anywhere from here to Hollowell.
Yeah, and there's an interesting story about that because, as serendipity has it, there are other coal mines that started here by as Mine 19. The shovel that preceded Big Brutus was a 950 Bucyrus-Erie shovel, and it actually was built by built here and dug its way to Hallowell, right? And the shovel that replaced the 950 is Big Brutus, and it started in Hallowell and drug its way to here, and it finished its life here. And it's 11 miles. It ran for 11 years, dug 11 miles. So it was there's so many serendipitous things about what happened with Brutus and how it became the museum and over the lifetime. It's just a fascinating story. And
but it dug many more than 11 miles, though. It dragged back and forth and back and forth in every one of those sections.
Yes. So when we were, my dad and I were creating this little booklet for kids out at Big Brutus, we figured out, or Dad figured out, the number of miles it would have had actually dug, right? And it would have dug a trench big enough, or not long enough, to reach outside of Fort Worth, Texas, from here to Fort Worth in its lifespan. That's one little bite at a time, one little 90 cube bite. That's not so little, and but dug a strip pit about 40 to 60 feet deep, about 120 feet wide, all the way to Fort Worth, Texas. So that's a lot of digging.
Or as your dad said to me the other day, all the way to the Mississippi River.
Oh yeah, if you dug a line straight, you ended up in Cairo, Illinois, right on the Mississippi River.
Oh, there's a place. That's a story there.
Yeah, you could have dug a canal to get you and gone fishing in the Mississippi. From West Monroe. So anyway, people would come in and talk about it, Well, my dad, as you know, worked for P&M, actually helped build it, was the day electrician on the shovel, and loved the job. You know, him and the guys that all worked on it loved the job. And they told him that they were getting ready to take bids to tear it down. And so my dad told me that they were doing this. I said, oh no, they can't tear that down. That'd be a wonderful tourist attraction, right? And get people from all over the place to come see it. And so I was on the city council here in West Mineral at the time. I'd been here working, you know, after working for Kmart, and took over the store. And while I was on the city council, I said, it was city council meeting, I said, we need to ask the State Historical Society to take over Brutus and make it a tourist attraction for the state of Kansas, because it has significant historical value. So we wrote a resolution and we sent it to the state, asked them to take over Big Brutus as a historical attraction, and the state wrote us, the Historical Society wrote us back and said, taking on Big Brutus as a historical attraction would be akin to preserving the Golden Gate Bridge, and the State of Kansas Historical Society just doesn't have enough money to do that. And so what we recommend is that you take, you know, photos of it, document it very well, and then let them go ahead and have it torn down. And so I was like, no, I don't take no for an answer sometimes, you know. And so I had been working on this, and so the Pittsburgh Morning Sun at the time caught wind that we had sent this to the resolution to the state, and that we'd turned down, and so they did an article on it. Well, the article caught the eye of the director at that time of the Pittsburgh Chamber of Commerce. Her name was Lunell Bath. And so Lunell called me and said, hey, I just read this article about what you were trying to do you know, with the state. What do you think about getting Big Brutus as a tourist attraction in general? And then I said, well, I think it would make an awesome one, because I know I told the same story. People come all the time. Plus it was the, you know, at the time it was built, it was the largest. There were larger ones built after that, but today it's the only remaining big shovel of its type. So Lunell said, well, how about you and I team up together and see if what we can get done. Now, her idea at first was to move it to Pittsburgh, tear it down and move the whole thing to Pittsburgh. Well, it cost $6 million to build. They had railroads that brought all the equipment in, and none of that exists anymore. I said it would be way massively expensive. I don't think you could raise the money to move it to Pittsburgh. And so she said, you know, I think I agree with what you're saying. So she said, why don't we form a blue ribbon panel, and we'll get you know, dignitaries from Southeast Kansas, from Pittsburgh, the State Game and Fish Commission. We'll get lawyers, anybody that you can think of that would be, you know, interested in doing this, and we'll hold a meeting, and we'll hold it here at the grade school in West Mineral, in the cafeteria there, and we'll get everybody in and we'll have a discussion about it. And so I put it together and invited all of these different people that we thought, you know, could have an interest in it and help us, the State Fish and Game Commission, the mayor of Mineral, a lawyer from Columbus, and a bunch of other people. And so we put it together, we had the meeting, and at the end of the meeting we decided that we definitely wanted to do it, and to do it we would have to form a non-profit corporation. And we made up the name at that night, Big Brutus Incorporated, for the nonprofit's name. And then after we formed the nonprofit corporation, we informed Chevron that we were definitely interested, and Chevron was the owner of Pittsburgh and Midway at the time, that we were interested in having it as a museum. Now, unbeknownst to me, in the background while this is happening, my dad is, you know, starting to work on taking bids, and Chevron gets in touch with the P&M director. Was it in Kansas City, Dad?
Yeah, it was Kenny Kemp. He was head of the electrical department in over P&M, over the area of P&M.
And he was located in Kansas City at the time, and so they asked him to look into it. Well, then Dad and Kenny came down to Big Brutus. Kenny came from Kansas City, And Kenny looked at it, and Dad kind of told him what the idea was, and he said, I believe it would make a good tourist attraction, you know, it would be, there is something of value here. So him and Dad went back to Lunell's office at the Pittsburgh Chamber of Commerce and told her Kemp told her that they thought he was going to make a recommendation to Chevron that they do go ahead and give it to this nonprofit corporation that had been formed. And so then after that happened, we started being introduced to a guy named Bill Reinhardt, who was like the kind of like a PR person for Chevron. And Bill was from Pittsburgh originally. And so he still had family there. And so our contact after that became Bill Reinhardt of Chevron. And, you know, they had said, yes, it is our intent, we would like to give it to you. But you have to have a 501c3 and all this. So then we applied for, Lunell and I put the paperwork together and applied for the 501c3. We got bylaws written for the corporation. We started having regular meetings, and then we started telling the public about what we were thinking about doing. Well, that started sparking a lot of interest in general. And there were, you know, as with anything, there's camps on both sides of things. Oh, that'll never work. You'll never do that, you know, what have you. And much to our amazement, in November of, I think it was 1984, the head of P&M came and was we went to the West Mineral Eagles Hall. They set it up there, and we made an announcement to the public that P&M was going to donate the shovel to Big Brutus Incorporated, and that they were going to help us restore it by giving us $100,000, which was in the form of a paint job. And that's where it all actually began, was in November of 1984. And by March of 1984, March of 1985, we started the cleanup process, and that involved the National Guard out of Pittsburgh, and a guy who was the head of the National Guard out of Pittsburgh at that time was Bob King, who lived here in West Mineral. And the National Guard came, and we held a cleanup day. Well, then my dad, who was still working at the Asbury mine of P&M at the time, he got together what we called the Sunday crew. And the Sunday crew, these guys worked 6 days a week, but on Sunday they would put all their efforts, they'd come over. I don't know, how many were there? Maybe 10, 20 of us?
Yeah, there's quite a few. Mainly guys that had worked with P&M with Brutus York, by 19, they came and helped. And the two I would like to really give credit to, the first Sunday we worked, that Monday morning, went to work, and there was a couple of welders there. It was Bill Gates and Gordon Nutt.
Gordon Nutt, yep.
They were both welders, and neither had worked at Mine 19. They come out of the shop there and said, "We're mad at you." He said, "What are you mad at me for?" "Well, you asked everybody here to go work on Brutus except us two." I said, "I died and went to heaven."
Oh, these two were...
These two guys were instrumental in getting all the welding done and everything, and their pictures are on the board out there at Brutus. But boy, I can't thank them enough.
So they helped, you know, the Sunday crew, and I don't know how many Sundays in a row we worked, but we worked every Sunday. And, you know, here they are working their butts off during the week, and then on Sundays coming. So we'd like supply food and drink and what have you for them while they were working. And we got pictures, documented pictures of it happening and what have you. And then by July 13th, 1985 is when we held the dedication for the shovel. And we had thousands of people come out, media. The governor of Kansas was here, had a beautiful formal dedication, and there are pictures of it. And so now that was just for the shovel, right? So that when we started, the next day, and like we had all of this prep to get Brutus open and all that, but we really hadn't put a lot of thought into what's the day-to-day operation going to be. And so we started out with a cigar box and a card table underneath the shade tree at the very beginning of when you go down, and people would come in and they'd park off on the side of the road there, the road that led down to the Brutus, and collect money in the cigar box. Well, that ended up, the next thing we bought, well, we got to do better than this because winter's coming, so we put in like a tool type shed and made an office out of that, and that was our first office. But we know, people were still coming, and they were coming in droves to see it. And so we needed to build a formal facility, a formal visitor center is what we wanted. And so we came up with the idea, and we pitched it to a local bank. Here's what we'd like to do is build this visitor center. Well, because it was so new, we didn't have a long track record, right? We don't know if it could maybe pull visitors in for, the first, because like my grandma used to say, a new broom sweeps clean. People are coming in now, but will they come in the long term? And my grandmother, my dad's mother, was a huge supporter. It was her dad who built this store back in 1907. And she was like our most staunch supporter, Big Brutus was everything. And so the bank told us, they couldn't give us a loan unless we had somebody who was willing to back up the loan with, some kind of collateral. So my grandmother had a $35,000 CD, certificate of deposit at the time, and she signed that over as collateral for the loan for Big Brutus to build the museum building that you see out there today.
And this is Emma
Jean Boccia.
Emma Jean Boccia.
And so we got it out. This is one of the shovels that was used in the groundbreaking ceremony, to get ready to build the actual museum. And so they built the museum that you see, the initial building that's been added on to since then. And they were able to pay back the loan, and Grandma's CD was safe, but she was one of our most ardent supporters of it. But I also want to mention, I make it sound like, I did everything, I did all that. I don't want people to come across that opinion. Everything needs a catalyst. When you mix two things together, right, there's a catalyst in there that causes it to create something else. I kind of consider myself the catalyst that got things going. If I hadn't been there as a catalyst, it probably wouldn't have happened. But it took all the work of the Sunday crews, volunteers. There were local women here who would take and they would sew little bags, like little bags that were orange with the Big Brutus seal on it, and we could close it. And they took ballast, which is what weighted down the back of Brutus so he wouldn't tip over when he dug the coal or the overburden.
Sure.
And so they made little bags of ballast to sell the souvenirs to help keep it going, right?
Well, I do have some questions.
Sure.
First, I guess the date of the Blue Ribbon Committee, what year was that?
That would have been in 1983 when it happened. I don't have the exact date in front of me.
And the dedication date was?
July 13th, 1985.
So it was about 2 years.
From beginning to end, took about, I would say, more like a year and a half, about like that to get it. Yeah.
And then there was one other question. No, slipped my mind.
That's all right.
Yeah.
So, but it was, again, all of the volunteers that over the years have worked on it, and then, there are some people who've been on the board of directors since its inception, right? And that includes my dad and mostly miners who have worked on the shovel, or family members of the miners who worked on it. And there are people who were there who were in that Blue Ribbon Committee that that started it.
And the other question I had was, the motors were taken out.
Yes.
Was that before 83?
That was happening at the time when Dad was starting to take bids to have it torn down, because the company decided that they could use those motors at other mine locations, so they didn't want them to be scrapped. Everything else they would have taken and just cut it up for scrap.
But
so
the dismantling had already sort of started.
Had already started.
I mean, this was in process when the Blue Ribbon Committee met and
everything was in forward motion. We knew that we had to work fast, and we actually asked Bob Dole, who was our senator at the time, to help us expedite the 501c3 get us, so that they could give it to us before, because they were on a timeline to tear it down. It was a liability, a huge, people going out and climbing on this thing. It was would be known as an attractive nuisance, and if somebody would have died or got killed, the family could have sued them for the accident.
Sure.
So they were wanting to get it torn down, and at the time, I think what helped was the scrap prices for iron at the time weren't that high. And so for them, it was like a win-win situation. We can talk and have it as in perpetuity, a museum, and they can show Big Brutus and this P&M's name on the side and what have you, and then we get it as a way to help draw tourism into the area. And I mean, it draws right now around 20,000 people, 22,000 people a year. To come in and see it. And you see, like if you go to Applebee's in Pittsburgh, right, they have a Big Brutus beer. If you go by Kansas Crossing Casino, they use Big Brutus, they use Brutus in their advertising.
Sure. And they have Big Brutus burgers around different places and things.
Yeah, so it's like, it's really something that this area can be proud of, and it's a seal of Southeast Kansas. Everybody knows about Big Brutus.
I know this is not my story particularly, but I had a friend who traveled across country from LA area all the way to Connecticut. And he went back roads a lot, and he saw a lot of things. But when he came home, the one thing that he was really impressed with, the thing that he was most impressed with in his trip was Big Brutus.
Yes.
He had stopped, and this would have been shortly after it opened, about 85, 86, right in there somewhere. And when he got back, Big Brutus, that's a real piss cutter.
Yeah, it is. It's so fun to see. Like little kids get up in the operator's cab, and, and it takes a lot of maintenance and what have you to keep things going, and then like people being what they are, they want to take a little souvenir. So when we first got it put together, my dad and others, they made the operator's cab look just like it did when it originally was running, right? Mm-hmm. Looked beautiful, everything was in place. But a little bit over the years, I got to take that button, I want this button, and they started taking little pieces off. So just recently, Dad and the P&M, a bunch of guys that worked at P&M and the people that work out at Big Brutus restored the operator's cab again. Now the goal is to get replicas of the motors that were there built. They have 3D printers, and what we're hoping we can get the dimensions of those and at least build one or two, or maybe if not all of them, put them all back in place, to show this is what the rotors look like, and then to have a recording of the sounds that it made on the inside. So like if a little kid wanted to go in and sit in the operator's cab, he could push the button that made the motors run to pull it up. And
there is a real spirit with Big Brutus I notice with the people that are working there now and what they're doing. It's constantly seeking to expand its role in mine history, in putting forward the Mackey shovel, the Page 222 drag line, all of the smaller equipment that's there.
And see, that's what you're bringing up a really good point, because the history behind all of this is, miners originally came here to work in deep shaft mines. Well, deep shaft mine here is not deep like you're thinking in Kentucky or these other places. The deepest seam is what, 160 feet?
160 feet here in Mineral.
Yeah.
I think in Arma they were up over 200 feet in some areas. Yes.
So it's not that deep, but it's deep enough. I wouldn't want to be down there working in a 3-foot space all day long or what have you. But deep shaft mining was what originally got started here, and then the small surface mining shovels started coming in, and they were more down towards the Cherokee County area and the southern Crawford County, and they started moving this direction. And Big Brutus and P&M are the ones that really started building these littler shovels, and they started off with 1-yard buckets, then a 5-yard bucket, then I think it went to a 20-yard bucket, then a 40-yard bucket, and then Big Brutus with his 90 cubic yard bucket was the apex.
The profit in coal must have been tremendous for them to be able to do that.
At the time it had to be, yeah. And what I think one of the things that spurred it on at the time, because there's a a connection to Spencer Gulf, right, and with P&M. And during World War II, Spencer, that started Spencer Gulf, came up with a chemical formula to extract petroleum out of coal. And they would use coal to make petroleum during World War II. So Big Brutus, or not Big Brutus, P&M played a huge role during World War II in making sure that there was enough energy to supply the U.S.'s efforts in the war. And he was actually recognized for that during the time. And that's what spurred then, let's build, a bigger machine. And I can remember even as I was a little kid, when the space, race was going on, that there would be commercials for Gulf Oil, and that's who owned P&M at the time, Gulf Oil, and they used Big Brutus in the commercials, and they were helping sponsor, the trip to the moon or what have you, so it was really cool.
Well, that's great, and that's what this is all about. It's why I'm here today. It's why we do what we do. The history of mining history of this area has everything to do with what's here now, and about the fact that there aren't as many people here. That's all, why there's so many little towns in this area, everything. But I want to thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today. There's just so much about this, and it'll go on, and we'll talk again. This is great, and I really appreciate it.
Yeah, really enjoyed it.
Okay, thank you, Victor.
You're welcome.